Common Purpose is a live stream podcast featuring Tim Kelly, a Chattanooga-based businessman and mayoral candidate who loves this city and has made his life here. Beyond the conversation, Common Purpose is a show about elevating the bonds that unite us as a community and resisting the forces that would tear us apart.
Welcome to Common Purpose, the podcast about elevating the bonds that unite us here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm Tim Kelly. Today we're joined by one of Chattanooga's most prominent citizens advocates to talk about how local government can work better for everybody here in Chattanooga, Helen Burns Sharp. Helen's the founder of ATM, which stands for Accountability for Taxpayer Money. And Helen really is our foremost local expert on accountability in city government. So I'm thrilled that she's agreed to join us here today. Helen, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate the invitation.
You're very welcome. I'm very much looking forward to diving into a wide range of topics with you. And so, again, don't feel bound by anything other than the standards of common decency. But we'll just dive right into it. If you would tell those in the audience who may not know you quite as well as I do, a little bit about your life's journey. Am I correct that you left Chattanooga for a little while and then came back?
I did. I grew up in Chattanooga, went away for school, came back, never thinking I would stay, thinking I was going probably to Washington, D.C. for some sort of career in public service. And at that time, I thought that Washington was where it was happening. And I came to discover that actually is where it's happening is at the local level.
Right.
That the city is really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak.
Absolutely right.
So I went on a journey that took me to three very different places. I worked in the Chattanooga area and areas around Chattanooga, particularly Marion County, which was very interesting because there I learned about how important it is to try to get governments to work together. Yeah. If anyone in our audience knows anything about high school football, they know that South Pittsburgh and Marion County Jasper are big football rivals.
That's right.
So one of my challenges as a young planner was getting them to work together on grants
that must have been
for an industrial park. Yes,
yeah, that must have been very interesting. Did you have to ban certain colors, or that might have been helpful?
You're exactly right. But anyway, so that was interesting. That was also the place where I met my husband, who was chairman of the Planning Commission, and marrying him was the best decision that I ever made. So that was obviously a highlight of the Marion County years. And then I went to a place that was considerably different, Cobb County in the Atlanta metro area, where I was the county planner. And I observed in Cobb the problems you can get into when you're making a lot of zoning decisions when you don't really have a planning context. Growth was happening so fast in Cobb that they were like routinely once a month considering like 40 zone changes.
Wow. And
they really didn't have plans in place to explain, to kind of deal with how the pieces fit or didn't fit. And then from suburban Cobb, I went to a medium-sized city in Oregon, Albany, Oregon, where I was for 18 years the community development director. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Oregon experience later because that definitely shaped me. When I retired in 2009, I had a decision to make as to whether to stay there or come back here, and it wasn't a given that I would come back to Chattanooga. I loved Oregon. I loved the weather, particularly in the summertime, and I had a lot of really good friends there. But I had family in Chattanooga, and my husband and I obviously had come back a lot to visit, and I was just blown away with all the changes in Chattanooga, and I sensed the energy, the vitality, and I thought this is where the city that I want to become a part of again.
That's great.
So I moved here and haven't looked back.
Well, that's wonderful, and it's consistent with the stories I hear from a lot of other people. I mean, again, I left Chattanooga and came back, and it's amazing how consistently you hear really talented people that could be anywhere doing any number of things who choose to be in Chattanooga because they see its potential, and it's great. It's great promise. So, you've had a lot of different perspectives from a lot of different cities. Can you talk a little bit about your takeaways on what works and what doesn't work to create great neighborhoods?
Well, let me just talk generally big picture. Particularly, I mentioned that Oregon was so important in informing my sense of what government can be. in thinking about it in preparation for this podcast, I realized to me it was sort of like a master class in planning and in good government.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about Oregon is that citizen involvement and transparency are sort of part of the DNA in Oregon. And there were things that I was exposed to there that I hadn't been exposed to before. The council manager form of government. My city had a city manager, very professionally run government. I learned much more about urban design and how important it is. In my early years as a planner, it was more about zoning and subdivision regulations, and didn't really realize how important urban design can be, to the point that I realized that a lot of concerns people sometimes have that they think relate to density really might relate to design, that if we have better design and if we have design standards that can help things fit together better, that, we can, I think, have some more density, which in terms of affordable housing and some other things can be a plus. I also learned that you can negotiate with companies as big as Costco to convince them to try to meet your design standards for community benefit. They had submitted a plan that was sort of their prototype. As a staff and as a city, we were delighted that Costco wanted to build in our city. But we had just adopted design standards that had transparency requirements and different things like that. And the first plan they submitted did not meet that exactly. And as a staff, we were terrified, thinking, "Oh, this is great. We're going to tell Costco, that they don't meet our design standards." But what happened when we said that? We said we had a concern about design and about transparency, and they said, "Oh, you mean fenestration?" Well, we acted like we use that word all the time.
Right.
Later, we went and looked up the dictionary and looked it up, and we said, "Oh yes, fenestration, very important to us," because we were calling it transparency.
Right.
And anyway, I will never forget this. They reached down in their briefcase and said, "Well, this is the plan you want then." So in other words, they have different plans, and they're going to go with the prototype and the one that's the easiest and the cheapest one for them to build if a community doesn't care.
Right. Yeah, we talked about that quite a lot, right? You just have to be clear about what
you have to be clear, and exactly.
Are.
And we actually had standards in our code, but we also said this is really important to us as a community. We're trying to pay more attention to design. This is Pacific Boulevard. It's the entrance to the city. We think this is going to set the tone. Make a statement or whatever, and basically they said sure.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. That's a great example. Well, you've been back in Chattanooga for about 10 years. Have you got thoughts? And we'll talk about accountability in a different question. But I mean, do you have any particular thoughts, having been back here, about how we do a better job of building community and in great neighborhoods in Chattanooga?
Well, it's interesting. As I look at Chattanooga's neighborhoods, I'm struck by a project that we did in my town called Great Neighborhoods, which basically was a listening experience where we, rather than assuming, I think sometimes we in government, whether it's elected officials or staff, we kind of think we have all the answers, and sometimes we don't really know what the questions are.
Right.
So we decided to go out, and we mailed something to everybody in the city, and had meetings at all of the middle schools, and had opportunities even, back then to put something, online or whatever type thing. And we just listened. And one of the things we were struck by is how, yes, some people wanted changes in their neighborhoods, but a lot of times there was a focus on what it is they liked about their neighborhoods and wanted to build on. So, so I think the term great neighborhoods, of course we wanted to make some even greater or whatever, but, and in Chattanooga, I think we've got a nice mix of neighborhoods. We've got urban, we've got suburban, we've got historic neighborhoods or whatever. And, and we all share the concern of potholes, right? And so there's some common issues, but also, I think there are some neighborhoods that have kind of unique challenges, such as St. Elmo and North Chattanooga, with the fact that there's some erosion possibilities
Steep
from
slopes and so on.
development on hillsides, and the city just simply must adopt some steep slopes
No question.
ordinance.
Right.
I can't believe it's taken this long. So that's something that needs to happen.
No doubt.
Another sort of serious topic that I think we're all aware of, but let me just kind of put a pin in this, is that I think we need to pay attention to the fact that there's a perception among some that they're like two Chattanoogas, and that people like me, were dazzled by the riverfront and how wonderful it is, and it is. And I think downtown's important to everybody. Sure. But we've got to realize that not everybody's been affected equally by all the good things that have happened to Chattanooga.
Certainly.
And that there are a lot of neighborhoods that are suffering from generational poverty. Yeah. And I'm thinking there's an opportunity here coming out of what was called the Area 3 Ridge to River Plan,
right,
is to take those neighborhoods between Missionary Ridge and the river, such as Avondale and East Chat and Glenwood and Ridgedale, Highland Park, Orchard Knob, Oak Grove, or whatever, and really do some serious implementation. That's a big picture plan, that's fine, but so often those become shelf plans.
Right.
And those, we need to figure out what are the things in there that need to be implemented, what are some of the zoning changes that need to happen, what are maybe some of the investments that could be made there. Yep. I mean, obviously what we want, ideally, we want private sector investment. Right. But sometimes, the public needs to sort of set the stage, obviously, with infrastructure. There might be a role for incentives in this area, but I think if we have some real focus on a particular part of town, and I think this would be a great place to start, make it kind of a success story. And in doing that, while we hope there's new development and all like that, we've got to be concerned about gentrification. No doubt. We've got to recognize, what has happened downtown and on the south side and along the riverfront or whatever, that most of us think is good, but when we take off our white privilege glasses, we realize that, these were predominantly black areas not that long ago, a generation ago, and where are these people going? Because they can't afford to stay.
No doubt. It is such a delicate management problem, and it really is we talk a lot about Goldilocks problems, but, the average income, I read that's for those that haven't, it's a 200-plus page study. It's incredibly comprehensive. But the average income in that River to Ridge area is $23,000 and change. Yeah. Less than half the median for the rest of the area. And so, while I think it desperately needs attention and private investment, the fleas come with a dog, as my grandmother used to say. And so, we've got to worry about gentrification and get it right. And getting it right is easier said than done, but we have to get it right.
We do, and we have to recognize and try to understand why there's some feelings of helplessness and hopelessness in these neighborhoods. Yep. And we can't wave a wand because a lot of it is income and it's poverty and it's educational. There's no easy fix. At the same time, if we can empower some of those people and if we can, help build up those neighborhoods and, and provide some jobs and things like that, it would just, I think, would be a real shot in the arm, not only to those neighborhoods, but to the entire community.
So, good segue. One of the steps in creating a great community plan that's reflective of the community is getting residents more involved. Have you got some ideas or examples of what you've seen in other cities where to do that? Because I think that's historically been a problem here. Getting a broad representative sample of residents involved in the process.
I mentioned the great neighborhoods that we did, where it was a city initiated thing. A lot of cities have neighborhood associations. Chattanooga has neighborhood associations. Nothing wrong with them, but at the same time, that's not the total answer. It tends to cater to people that don't mind going to meetings.
Right. Have the time to go to meetings.
And have time to go to meetings or whatever. So it might skew a little bit older towards retired people. Not necessarily, but it might. And also that structure, and I think there's a role for neighborhood associations, but I think that structure sort of predates social networks and all,
Mm-hmm.
and all the sharing of information. I mean, the Facebook groups on responsible development or this, that, and the other, and the next door kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there are just so many things out there that where people are communicating, and we need to sort of take advantage of those. And I mean, there's a question as to how involved does government need to get in this, because a lot of this stuff is just up to people and what people want to do in their neighborhoods. At the same time, that's obviously a good way for the city to share information and request input and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, we could perhaps use that more. I ran across a poster back when we were doing Great Neighborhoods, and it was just talking about, you know, just little things that people in a neighborhood can do. And among them were things like turn off your TV, leave your house, know your neighbors, greet people, look up when you meet somebody on the street, you know.
Go borrow that cup of sugar, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And cook extra for dinner and take it to someone, and you know, and get to know your neighborhood school. Just because you don't have children in that school doesn't mean, you know, neighborhood schools are part of the fabric of the community. They're important to all of us,
They are.
whether we have children or grandchildren in those schools or not.
That's a great point.
There are just a lot of things like that you know we could encourage. And of course, people are pretty smart. They've figured out some of these things. But there again, going back to the two Chattanoogas, that's probably more likely to happen right now in a middle class or an upper class neighborhood. Whereas if there are people that are actually worried about putting food on the table, or are more concerned about public safety.
Well, that's exactly right. It's a great point, and it's not for lack of caring or engagement. A lot of times, it's just lack of bandwidth, right?
Exactly.
Well, shifting gears just a little bit, one of the things I find really fascinating about you, very candidly, Helen, is that in all the detailed discussions we've had about good government, I've really never been able to detect your ideology, which is something that I hope people can say about me, because I think it has to do with competence and intelligence much more so than ideology. But you know, accountability is a word that keeps coming up. Can you talk a little bit on this as kind of a philosophical softball? But is there a relationship between accountability and ideology? Does accountability have an ideology?
You know, Tim, I don't think it does. I think that's a great question. One of the things when I never intended to make monitoring tax breaks my encore career.
Right.
When I came back to Chattanooga, I thought, my friends laughed at me, but I said, I'm going to become a normal person. They didn't think there was much chance of that, but I said, well, I'll show them. And then I thought, well, what does a normal person do in retirement? And I thought, oh, well, I'll take naps and I'll clip coupons and I'll do a little volunteering.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like I thought I'm just going to go back to Chattanooga and raise hell about tax breaks, you know. And so, you know, I'm sort of answering your question. I will try to get to it. But what happened is I just happened to see an article in the paper in 2012 about Chattanooga's first TIF, tax increment financing. And I was interested, not because I thought that was a bad idea. I had worked on 3 TIFs in Oregon and thought TIFs can be a good tool. I was just interested. And then I got frustrated because I would ask questions of the city, basic general questions, and nobody would or could answer my questions. And I thought, well, wait a minute. You know, this is a fairly significant tax break that's going to last 20 years, and nobody can seem to answer any of these questions. So anyway, I got a little bit irritated and miffed about it, and did something that wasn't very smart for me financially. My poor little retirement fund kind of dwindled a little bit, but I actually filed a lawsuit about that, and I was trying to get the attention of the city that, you know, you need to pay attention to these things. You need to ask the right questions. You need to make sure that in the agreements, if you choose to give a tax break, that you're putting some things in there that protect the public.
Of course.
I wasn't trying to be unreasonable, and I didn't actually have anything against that particular development or those developers. It wasn't anything personal at all. So when you get back to the ideology question, what's been so interesting to me, and the only really cool thing I would say, I mean, I've thought about, could I have picked a topic that was more in the weeds, and even people that like me and all like that, they you know, I'm not exactly somebody that somebody wants to see at a cocktail party or whatever, because they know that I will get off on TIFs and pilots and things like that. And even
For the
if
record, I would love to talk about that stuff at a cocktail party. But
yeah,
I'm weird too. So.
Well, so I mean, this, is not the most interesting thing to most people. I mean, so I need to get my elevator story down a little better, but I've never been able to do that either. But here's one really cool thing about this I found is that this issue of accountability for taxpayer money resonates across the political spectrum.
Of course, yeah.
And one of the reasons, I mean, I've explained why I got involved, but, how I got involved, but why I got involved is I think there are two reasons. One is tax equity. And I think this is something that conservatives and libertarians kind of think, well, wait a minute, why are we giving a tax break to this business but not to this business? Particularly since in Chattanooga we don't have any policies or criteria explaining how we make these decisions anyway. I hope we get into that in a minute. But anyway, so there's the tax equity standpoint that may be of more interest to kind of people on the right. And then there's the social justice issues that may be a little left of center, but I think we're all kind of concerned about that because, I mean, this is like a big deal. I mean, like last 2019, we didn't collect $25 million in city and county property tax because of tax breaks. Okay.
Am I right to say that that's more than any other metro county in the state?
It's more than any other county in the state. And so I've always said, and will say again, that I don't think all tax breaks are bad. And a lot of this is Volkswagen. And am I glad Volkswagen's here? You bet. Do I think we needed to give them an incentive? We did, because we could have lost them to Huntsville or other places. Right. But what we did is we gave them the sun, the moon, and the stars.
Right.
And we just basically took something that looks like their attorneys wrote and said, great. And, so we let it last for 30 years, like the new Toyota Mazda plant in Huntsville lasts for 20. We don't have anything in there about wages. The clawback language is weird. So it's not that we shouldn't have given it, but we need, this is my biggest sort of, issue with this whole area is it doesn't seem like we have anybody at the table representing the public.
Right.
And so even when we decide to give one, and as I said, this is a rare case of where it did have a significant public benefit, no question, and it was a catalyst, the number of jobs, the amount of the investment or whatever, and I think we thought correctly that other people were very much interested in them. And what happens a lot, I think, when people come to a city, they ask for a tax break. And, I can't fault the business for doing it, but I don't think we push back enough to find out if they really need it. I mean, there was a company that we gave a pilot to a couple of years ago, and they had said 2 years before, Chattanooga's wonderful, we've got the best workforce, and EPB Internet is second to none. If we ever expand, it's going to be in Chattanooga. Well, 2 years later they come, and what do they want? They want a tax break.
Yeah.
Well, we had seemingly forgotten all of that. And, and they said stuff like, oh, well, we might go to Richmond or we might go to so-and-so. And I'm thinking, yeah, right, you're going to take your current employees and your EPB Internet with you, But, unfortunately, since we don't have policies adopted,
right.
Particularly the elected officials, by the time it gets to them, they're in a tough spot because they want to be perceived as wanting jobs. We all want jobs.
Right.
Jobs are critically important to everything, including quality of life things that are important, like outdoor stuff and things, things like that. But, we just need to be, we need to be more strategic in these things.
Yes.
And so anyway, that's as I said, I think the really cool thing. And so I think accountability. I think we're looking today for issues that can kind of bring us together, and there don't seem to be a lot of them out there right now. But I think accountability is one of those things that everybody, I believe, is for.
Well, I agree. I mean, again, the essence to me of good local government is exactly that. It's about competency and accountability, not about ideology. And look, democracy starts, I think, Of course it does at the local level. This is a observation I've stumbled across here recently, is that a lot of for democracy to work, you have to have engaged citizenry, and people have to feel as though what they say and what they do matters, and that starts at the local level. So look, I mean, it's not a trivial observation. So let me just jump ahead then, since we got into this. How do we? How do you think we can make local government more responsive and more accountable?
Well, I think there are a couple of things, and we can talk tax breaks, but let's just talk generally.
We'll get tax breaks is the next question.
Okay,
I want to get specific about. I want to get specific about best practices from other cities. But
okay, all right.
You can take it whatever order you like.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things I think we could do to increase transparency.
Okay.
One thing I think we need to do is that when elected officials are asked to approve either tax breaks or make zoning decisions, there needs to be something that's part of a normal city council meeting and a planning commission meeting when it's zoning, to say, does anyone need to declare a conflict of interest? There are two kinds of conflicts of interest. One is actual. Obviously, if your Aunt Sue owns the business and wanting a zone change, obviously that's a conflict of interest, and you would not only want to disclose that, you would want to step down from the podium, and you would know to do that. But another thing, and the reason this matters so to me, is this is actually state law in Oregon. You don't have a planning commission or a zoning hearing before a city or county body that it starts out with this.
Right.
And the whole point is to just put everything on the record.
Absolutely.
And so, the second part is, does anyone need to declare conflict of interest, where you've got the actual or the financial pecuniary conflict of interest, but sometimes there are appearances of conflict of interest.
Right.
And so that's where, particularly for elected officials, it doesn't mean you have to, if a campaign contributor is wanting a zone change or a pilot, doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't necessarily have to disclose that unless the person had written you a check for $1 gazillion, and then you might want to or whatever. But if someone has lent their support and is on a steering committee and has helped advertise for your campaign, lent their name to it or whatever, just to put that out there and say, John Doe was on my steering committee. And while I appreciate that, that will have no bearing on my ability to be an impartial decision maker.
Sure, right.
But put it on the public record so people out in the audience aren't saying, we all know that not only did John Doe give all this money to Pete Smith, but he really was a behind the scenes, very much involved in the campaign. So put it on the record. So that's something that I think we could do.
Yep, it's a great idea.
And we need to, I think, have more, another Oregon thing, state law again, a planning commission can't have more than 40% of its membership from the development community. So we're not just talking about developers, but we're talking about realtors, and we're talking about architects, and we're talking about engineers. And all of these people have a lot to offer.
Right.
They have a lot of expertise in this area. Certainly, we need that perspective on the planning commission. But what about neighborhood leaders?
Sure.
I mean, I've heard a number of sort of neighborhood people say, we don't really have a planning commission, we have a development commission.
Gets back to that engagement piece. We got to have good people from the neighborhoods stepping up, but they need to feel as though their efforts aren't in vain, I think.
And also we need to realize that it is, and I forget how this works. I think the two mayors, city and county mayors, choose the chair of the planning commission. And I think each of the mayors, I don't know if there's a role for the council or not, but I'm not sure how the lay members get selected. But my recommendation is, as vacancies occur in the future, let's think about getting some neighborhood people on there.
I've seen in 30 years of board service here, it's taken about that long, really. It's only been in the last few that I've realized that the devil really is in the details. And board governance and board structure is so critically important to determining outcomes.
Right.
How are those folks appointed? How often do they turn over? Who are they answerable to? That stuff seems very dry and boring, but nothing's more important, in my opinion, than making sure that that stuff is done correctly.
And I think, too, that, yes, we have neighborhood association leaders, some of whom are outstanding, but I think we need to be looking at the person and what they can bring, say, to the Planning Commission,
Right.
that it shouldn't be an automatic, the head of such and such neighborhood association is on the Planning Commission. Maybe so. It might be a great person, or there might be somebody that's just sort of out there freelancing that you might think has a lot to offer, but would have maybe a neighborhood, more holistic perspective.
Yeah, look, I think the old saying, it's not who you know, or rather, it's not what you know, it's who you know, isn't a very benign way to do things, right? I mean, I think arguably we need a little more of what you know and a little less of who you know, and that's where transparency and accountability come in to me. Because as you say, I've run into situations in board service in the last 30 years where there actually wasn't anything malignant or venal going on, but the appearance is worse than the crime. Why would you do that to yourself? If you set the table correctly, it's just best for all parties, very frankly. I think, and that's your experience is indispensable in that regard. Those are great examples.
There's a quote from former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis who said, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
That's absolutely right.
And, and so, making the actions of public officials more visible to the public is a powerful way, not only of stamping out unethical and unprofessional behavior, but in building public trust.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think that this isn't on the agenda, but I'm just going to freelance a little bit. One of the really disturbing trends that we're dealing with in the United States generally, and in mid-sized markets like Chattanooga in particular, is the hollowing out of that journalistic function. It used to be we could rely on newspapers to really do the homework. And as somebody who started out in college thinking that was what I was going to do for a living, wrote for the high school newspaper and the college newspaper. It's sad to see. We have to either fill that with very ethical leadership that's committed to transparency, or rely on. I mean, very frankly, Chattanooga is fortunate that we've got somebody like you to do, very frankly, what we used to rely on journalists to do. Not that our local journalists aren't doing anything at all, but very frankly, obviously the business models have changed, and it's much more difficult for them to really staff effectively to do what historically they have done, to maintain that balance between the public interests and private interests.
Exactly, and I think a shout out to our broadsheet, the Times Free Press. I think of the 4 major newspapers in the state, it's probably the best.
There's no question. There is no question. We're very fortunate to have them relative to our peers around the state. And so, look, you're right. I don't mean to be told.
Oh, and I know you didn't. And I feel like anytime if you want. To get me going, other than on tax breaks, get me going about people that don't subscribe because they don't want to pay for it. And I'm thinking, hello, this is not a lot to pay to be involved in your community and to know what's going on in your community. And it takes a little bit of money to pay these reporters, particularly, just to do the basics, but any kind of investigative kind of thing or whatever, that's not free.
It's true. I mean, I don't want to get us off topic, but I'm a localist, as you well know, and that is one of the things that is most troubling to me. I think we need more focus on local news and local information. And I look from a business perspective, I think it's a great opportunity, because that's the sort of thing you're never going to get by tuning into Fox News or CNN. Only local entities can produce quality local news. So I think there is a future in it. They just have to work out the business model. And I think they're making progress, right? I think so.
I think so. Yeah.
All right. Well, you've had a chance over the years to compare our approach to tax incentives with other cities, and other places you've worked. Let's get into the nitty-gritty a little bit. What are some of the best practices from other cities that we might look at adopting here relative to the way we handle pilots and TIFs and other tax incentives?
If you don't mind, Tim, let's go back a little bit to transparency generally.
Sure.
And because I think one of the things that needs to be addressed in Chattanooga, and I think there's a structural solution, and that is changing the council manager form of government, which is something that I hope we look at. I know we're not there yet, but
and
I think
we should talk a little bit about that. You know, your take on that's very interesting. We can dive into that if you like.
Well, you know, not necessarily, but having come out, I'll tell you the reason that I really think it's important in Chattanooga. I know after I would go to city council meetings for 3 or 4 years, and I would be talking about the same things over and over, and I would get this sort of blank look, you know, on the faces of these city councilors, and I would think, you know, why is this? And then I started thinking about my experience in Oregon, where, you know, I served as staff to the city council and planning commission. And I thought, you know, our city council's equally bright. They're equally honorable. I think these are good, decent people. My city in Oregon, unlike probably the public perception that it's some, you know, left-wing place, it's kind of the rural-urban thing where, you know, the cities, you know, tend to be Democratic and the rest of the state's Republican, you know. And my city was decidedly purple. So it had nothing to do with political ideology.
And so is Chattanooga, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, it finally, and I kind of thought, well, you know, you're kind of thick, Helen, for it having, you know, taken you this long. I thought, you know, why is it that I'm having trouble getting through? And then I realized it's the form of government, dummy, because what was happening is that in Oregon, and this was in a council manager form of government, the staff was providing the councilors with written staff reports that would lay out, you know, the background, what's being requested, the issues, if there was a particular policy issue. I mean, we knew our role, and we knew they were the elected officials. It was their decision, so we didn't, you know, write, or you'd be stupid if you didn't do this, you know, but we tried to lay it out. And what I realized here in Chattanooga is that our elected officials aren't getting this.
Right.
They're not getting this on anything, basically. And it really struck me. This has nothing to do with tax breaks, but all of a sudden, a couple of years ago, it appeared on their agenda, a half-a-page resolution saying that had been prepared by the mayor's office that said the city council hereby declares these 3 properties to be surplus. Well, these 3 properties happen to be in the vicinity of City Hall and where the internal audit office was and the city attorney's office was and all like that. It didn't say why this was being proposed. It didn't say, and these are city-owned buildings. It didn't say where these people were going and how we were going to lease space for these people. And I'm not saying, Tim, it was necessarily a bad idea. I mean, it must have had something going for it, or I don't think it would have been proposed. But to ask the council to do this, and they didn't even identify, they just put the street address, you know, such and such East 11th Street.
I gotcha.
You know, you didn't even know this is where the city attorney is and 311 is and all like that. I mean, it's just nuts. So I think that's part of the reason that I feel like that one, yes, I think we need to look at form of government down the road, but we definitely need to start giving the city councilors and the members of boards and commissions more information in writing, and that's something that could start immediately.
So this is, for the record, not a campaign podcast in any way, shape, or form, but I think it's fair to say, for the people who may not be aware, that you know, that's not the form of government we have now.
Right.
But like you say, that we can replicate that by adding perhaps a position that would independently advise the council on impact policy and budget impacts, right? But the strong mayor model, which is what we have, is very different, and I guess it just makes the stakes that much higher as to who is the mayor at any given point in time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the things, I mean, clearly strong mayors, if you start looking at the literature, and this is on the ATM website, some examples, and a lot of the the perceived best governed cities are council manager, but I'm not saying we don't have some good, strong mayor cities. But we have a lot of, quote, strong mayors in council manager governments.
Right.
Like if you're familiar with Greenville, South Carolina, and what they've done over the years, that's been council manager forever.
Right.
Charleston's been council manager forever. Maryville, Tennessee is.
Seems like it lowers the fluctuation.
It lowers the fluctuation, and what it does, it allows the mayor, it does a couple of things. It allows the mayor to help, provide the vision and the leadership. And the things about, filling the potholes or whatever, that's the manager's problem. I mean, the mayor and the council tell the manager what to do. The manager doesn't just go off and say, I'm not elected, but I get to decide such and such. The manager carries out the policies.
Right.
And the other thing that I would like about this, I think if I were a mayor, certainly if I were on the council, is it's not called the mayor or city manager form of government, it's the mayor council form of government. So what you have here is the mayor and the council at the same meeting. Imagine that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things that I've been struck about Chattanooga is, I think somehow I get the perception that maybe, and this varies with the mayor, but that the mayor is about as hard to get to see as the Pope in some ways.
Well, again, it can be.
It can be. It doesn't have to be.
Doesn't have to be.
But it can be. And I will contrast that, even though the county commission certainly isn't a council, a commission manager form of government either. But Mayor Coppinger's there at the meetings, and he knows he's not part of the commission, but I think it's invaluable for him to be there.
There is no question about it, if only for the dialogue for the public. And look, I mean, I completely agree, and I think it's a question. I mean, if in fact the mayor council form of government is better, I think a lot of those things can be replicated in our current model. But as we discussed, it'd be really great if the next mayor were able to consider a transition to this model, which I think, as you've pointed out, the track record's pretty hard to argue with, is a better form.
Well, yeah, and it's one of those things that I don't think anybody should be scared about it, but I also know that it's not anything we've had around here. That's not to say that there aren't. And you can't just call someone a city manager, take somebody, and call them the city manager or whatever and say we've got a city manager form of government. I mean, you've got to have the professionalism. Right. And I think that one of the reasons, I guess, that maybe I appreciate it personally is that not only do you hire a professional city manager who is trained in this area, but then that manager hires the department heads. And guess what? They hire the department heads based on professional credentials and experience.
They're good at organizational management. That's what they're doing.
Well,
they're
also, so you're not just hiring somebody because they helped you out in your campaign or whatever.
Yeah. Well,
and that, and so that's the reason. I mean, why did I start working in Oregon? They did a national search, had 90 applicants. Apparently, I looked good on paper. They interviewed me, and they thought, wow, she could be part of our diversity program. No one in Oregon's ever heard a Southern accent.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
So they took a chance on me.
That's good stuff.
Based on my education, my experience, and this kind of thing. So I'm just I'm hoping that it's there is more of a potential for crony capitalism if there's one person that developers can sort of court and woo. Than if it's if it's an entire body.
It seems to me that the stakes are much higher. Voters should be looking at again, not a campaign ad, but it does make special interests. It raises the stakes in that regard quite a bit, because a strong mayor can very frankly steamroll and do a lot of things that a council manager form aren't possible, or it's not as certainly not as easy to get through. So I get it. I do think it's important to note that those things can be replicated in our current form, but they're based entirely on the maybe the good fortune of getting the right person in the position, because if you get the wrong person in the position, it can go the other way in a hurry, right?
Yeah, and not that there's necessarily corruption or whatever.
No, but
I mean, some people are better
Yeah.
better executives than others, and all like that. I mean, so it's not any kind of a criticism against a particular person or a particular mayor at all. It's just that, and asking somebody to be the chief policymaker and also the chief implementer.
Yeah. It's tough. I mean, right now, the mayor of Chattanooga is, in essence, the CEO of the 9th largest employer in the entire region. And so, I mean, very frankly, again, currently the electorate should probably be considering that when they're looking at who the next mayor should be. This is not a campaign pitch in any way, shape, or form, but arguably that's a tall order. And so again, as we've talked about, I think it makes a lot of sense for the city to take a look at this other forum because the track record's great from places like Greenville and Columbia, or not Columbia, but Charleston. That's right. That's correct.
And something else I think too. I think right now we need to level the playing field a bit. We've got a strong mayor and a weak council. And this has nothing to do with who's on the council.
Right.
But when you realize the council isn't given much information currently, they have really no professional staff.
Right.
They have access to the city attorney, kind of. But guess what? You know, if the mayor is wanting something from the city attorney and a particular counselor, one of 9, is wanting something from the city attorney, guess who's going to take priority? And in a way, we understand that.
Of course.
So that's the reason I think you see, even though the counselors have things that they're interested in, but in terms, it's hard for the council to initiate any major change. I mean, I remember Chris Anderson tried with backyard chickens, and I think Chip Henderson, in terms of the short-term vacation rentals.
Right.
I think that was something that he and the council sort of elevated. I don't think that came from the mayor's office. So it can be done, but who does the professional research?
Right.
Yeah. And I think too that we can probably do a better job with best practices.
No question.
I think I somehow get the impression, and I want to say that there's a lot good about Chattanooga and about Chattanooga city government. This is not intended to be an indictment. I think, as I said earlier, I think a lot of this is sort of structural in nature. And I think if we could get the structure right, then things would just be a whole lot better.
Could not agree more.
And so we've got the unlevel playing field between the mayor and council, and the unlevel playing field between the private sector and the public sector.
Yep.
And so, when we're dealing with tax breaks or whatever, we have the lawyers for the companies and this, that, and the other, and then we use the Chamber of Commerce. Not necessarily a bad idea. I think we need to look. Hope the next mayor will look at everything. It's not unusual. The Chamber's got good expertise, but we shouldn't be delegating what's a government function to a business entity unless we tell them what it is we want. And the way we tell them what we want is we the council, the mayor proposing it, proposes, here are the criteria, here are the policies.
Right. Yeah.
And so, if we can get that playing field level between mayor and council and between public and private sector, that would be wonderful.
I think that's exactly right. And it has to do with communication and intentionality and clarity. All right. So, we can talk about whatever else you'd like to, but the last question I've got, we can wrap up with, is back to that best practices in the way that tax incentives are handled. How might that look differently based on best practices from other cities?
Well, one of the things I wanted to say in giving me the question, a few of the possible questions ahead of time. One of the questions said, what are we doing right? And I remember as a young planner hearing Alex Haley speak, and I remember something. I don't know if he said this originally or was quoting someone else, but he said, "Find the good and praise it." And there is, when that's the most uncomfortable thing. The cool thing has been, lots of people throughout the spectrum think this is an important issue. The uncool thing is being perceived and coming across as the constant critic, and so I love the opportunity to say good things. I have trouble in this area of tax breaks saying too many good things, but I hope in the next year or two I'll be able to say more. But one thing that we're doing right that not every city or county in the state or even the nation does is that back in 2008, the county commission said we're not going to grant a waiver or an abatement on taxes for schools.
Yeah.
Now, we've never written that down, so this is a little bit scary. And we have one or two examples of somehow places that fell through the cracks on that. But generally, we're good about that. So that's wonderful.
Yes,
because
it is. Yeah.
we should not abate those taxes.
Absolutely.
So that's excellent. Now, in terms of what we can do, I think it's really kind of pretty simple that anytime I start talking about criteria and policies, even my friends, their eyes start to glaze over and they kind of go, here she goes again or whatever. And so, it's really pretty simple. I mean, I think that if we're going to, I think we need economic development incentives in our toolbox. Not all they're not inherently bad, but we need to be strategic.
Absolutely.
When we use them for the reasons we talked about earlier, because there's a lot of money we're not collecting that could go to very important kinds of things that are needed in our community. But if we would talk about, and this is one thing we did in Oregon on land use. We put the burden on the applicant to demonstrate how they met criteria. This was in land use. If you wanted a zone change, we had criteria for a zone change, and the applicant was asked to address how they met them.
Gotcha.
And we might agree or might not agree, or would ask questions or whatever.
Probably cut back on a lot of the back and forth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let the person who's making an investment and taking some risk and all like that, but wanting the public's help on this, let them make the case. And I think there are two key what I call threshold criteria. One, the business should be asked to explain how their project, whether it's a location or an expansion, what is the significant public benefit. And normally we measure that in number of jobs, amount of investment, amount the jobs pay, whether or not the project's a catalyst or whatever. Okay. So, and then the second one, and this is we kind of alluded to this earlier, in the example, about EPB Internet, is that they need to demonstrate, and part of this is the straight face test, because I think some businesses, if they knew we were looking at this, they wouldn't even ask if they thought this was going to be scrutinized, because, this is called the but-for test.
Right.
And so ask the business to demonstrate that without the incentive, that they wouldn't be here.
All right.
And I think in Knoxville, for TIFs, I believe they require the applicant to sign an affidavit saying, without the TIF, I wouldn't do the project.
Interesting.
Now, somebody needs to check me on that, but I think that may be
we'll definitely look into that.
Might be the case. So, there's some literature by the group called Good Jobs First, which is a nonprofit that looks at this issue. And what they say, and I think they're correct because I did economic development in my career some, and that is that, businesses will say they need they want the incentive, you understand that, they're asking for the incentive, okay, but that doesn't mean we automatically give it. And so, they need to demonstrate that they wouldn't be here without it. And the sort of the consensus of people, and when they interview selection consultants whose job it is to help say, oh, my client, needs this tax break or whatever, that normally when a company comes to the city, let's say, to the chamber or whatever, who's acting as our agent or whatever, that generally the cake is already baked, and the tax break is the icing on the cake.
Correct.
That businesses, and I don't need to be telling you about business. You know a lot more about business than I do.
I know a thing or two.
Yeah, you do. And so, the businesses make decisions based on business metrics,
Correct.
on labor force, on infrastructure, on transportation, on all sorts of stuff that I don't fully understand. Quality of life to some degree, because executives, want to live in a nice place, this, that, and the other. If they can get a tax break, great. Yeah. But normally that's not the determining factor. And so that's where, I mean, that, this whole thing is more an art than a science.
It definitely is, right? I mean, you can't blame a compass for pointing north, as they say. Of course, they're going to ask for it, and I think what the city has been lacking, as you've said, is clear criteria around it. There is, and my friends in the business community would tell you the same thing. What they want is predictability and clarity and transparency. They want it probably as much as the taxpayer wants it, so that it's not cloak and dagger, and so that it's not smoky backroom stuff, right? I mean,
Right.
I personally think, look, there's what is the difference in value to the community between a job in an entity that is a local cluster versus a traded cluster? I mean, that's kind of wonky economic stuff, but traded clusters bring in capital from outside, where local clusters are great too. A business in a local cluster, and a car dealership is a classic example, mainly is just buying and selling things to people within the community versus, very frankly, an entity like Volkswagen, where there's capital coming into the community because they're selling things and sending stuff out. And it's just an example, right? But we just need to think more intentionally about the whys and the wherefores. And as you say, the but-for test. If you're going to do this, I personally also think that if, in fact, we're going to offer public incentives, then there ought to be some strings attached to using local resources, local vendors, local labor to do the work. Why on earth would the city incentivize a company to come in and do work and then use a contractor, for example, who's driving in from Charlotte? How much sense does that make?
So
in terms of the preservation of local capital? No sense at all to me.
So it's not only in construction jobs, but in permanent jobs.
Of course.
I mean, and you have a place like Volkswagen, I believe almost 40% of their jobs go to people outside of Hamilton County, and yet we are subsidizing them to the tune of about $500 million.
Well,
our property tax. But now, and I don't know how you get at that, but I think that in addition to those threshold criteria, significant public benefit, the but-for test, that we need some policies like what are the wages? I mean, a company has the right to pay whatever they want to pay, but if they want the taxpayers to help, I think it's okay that we ask for a living wage, whatever that's defined to be.
No question.
And I think we could ask for some things about, in terms of local, local labor and things like that. I mean,
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. And look, probably worth saying. My dad used to say all the time, look, if this were simple, we'd have already figured it out. These are very complicated problems. The issue with VW, I think, to a large extent, is they were, clearly, we may have oversold the capabilities of the labor market here. So I know there was a lot of frustration early on. They couldn't find people to fill the jobs. People came in from out of market, which is a tragedy and goes back to the need for education reform. That's a different podcast. We've already done that one. But, look, we have to have reform in skilled labor training. And so it is a multivariate, complicated problem. But we have to think, I think, very specifically and intentionally about what constitutes good policy. And again, if we're going to give tax breaks, why, right? And it's not because you're a good old boy. It's because it is for the public benefit, I think, right?
Yeah, and something that is kind of seems a little wonky, but I don't know if I haven't ever put this to anybody, so I'll ask you. Your view on it is that I think normally, the way this works, the way they get a pilot, payment in lieu of taxes, is that the Constitution prohibits the city from treating businesses differently for taxation. So we came up with this way of kind of going around that by creating industrial development boards, which is a city entity. And what they do is they take title, so they technically own Volkswagen, let's say, and all the places that have pilots, but then they lease it back for a nominal fee like $1. So they're not, the city's not actually running, Volkswagen. Volkswagen is which is probably good. But anyway, one of the things I think most people think, and I thought initially, is that we're talking about the land and the building that are under a pilot agreement. Well, yes, but many And in fact, I don't want to say most, and you could do some research and figure this out, but the real popular thing has been to come anytime you need new equipment. And that, I think, raises some policy issues because arguably I think you could say that, let's say, we need a policy about clawbacks, about what if the company doesn't meet its commitments, what are we going to do about that? So that's a policy we clearly need. But, what about if a company closes and they have all this highly specialized equipment that theoretically is owned by the Industrial Development Board?
Right.
Now, I'm not smart enough to figure out what that means, or if that means anything.
Well, it does, I think, in the sense that, well, first of all, I would say, as you well know, the city does not have a great record of enforcing clawbacks, which creates a huge moral hazard issue.
Right.
If we hold companies and we hold them to these promises that say they're going to do things and they just don't do them, then that creates a terrible precedent for future incentive. And I would say, look, I think a lot of this has to do with momentum. When a city gets, or in our case, regains positive economic momentum, the balance of negotiation in any sort of incentive discussion changes. If you are the belle of the ball, very frankly, then it's not nearly as expensive a proposition. In that specific instance, I think what you'd have to do is just as a bank would attach a lien, you'd have to kind of look at the value of that equipment and attach a value to it, and figure out what the equivalent value is in case there, in case there was a default. But that's getting in the weeds a little bit. But
well,
but that's where I think business experience is very frankly important in our current form of government in America.
There was an activist who worked at Volkswagen. He worked at DuPont, and I don't know if your paths ever crossed with him. His name was Joe Rowe.
I did not know.
And he died a couple of years ago, unfortunately. Somebody called him a giant oak tree of activism. And he came to a public hearing just kind of out of the blue, sort of talking about, you call it, he was black, and he said, you call it, gig city, we call it rig city sometimes, because look at the double standard here. You give these huge tax breaks to companies that probably don't even need them.
Right.
And then you don't enforce them.
Yeah.
And then people in my neighborhood who get behind on their property taxes
lose their houses.
Right.
Not okay.
Not okay.
Not okay in any way, shape, or form.
Not
right.
okay. And so, we have got to, I want to say, recommit to enforcing these. I think Mayor Burke did say with Alstom, where we hired an outside attorney who said we needed $13 million in settlement, but we decided $6 million was okay. I don't quite understand that. But the mayor did say that was the only time that we had clawed back. And I believe that's right. I think we've had the pilot program since about 1985, and I think we've had maybe about 100 pilot agreements.
And one clawback?
One clawback, and then we
hopefully that never happens, obviously.
Well, exactly, but it can.
Yeah.
And I think right now that, the companies know that it would just be a slap on the wrist, that if they were to say, well, this has been a tough year. We've had a pandemic. Right. Well, people who are trying to pay their mortgage payments
have
or
had
whatever,
a pretty tough year, too.
They've had a pretty tough year, too. So, I think right now we're kind of a toothless tiger. But the good thing about this whole thing, about policies, is that it's not rocket science. There's some suggestions on the ATM website. It's kind of been pulled from different areas or whatever, like about clawbacks and about wages and about, hiring and this, that, and the other. But this is just a matter of political will.
That's a very good way of putting it. And I think that's a good place to wrap it up. We've been here a little while. I so appreciate your passion for Chattanooga, and thank God you're here, honestly, to kind of stand in the gap for taxpayers and citizens. And if I am lucky enough to get elected mayor, I look forward to you holding me accountable, very frankly. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. And a big thanks to our audience for tuning in. Feel free to chime in with any feedback you got. And if there's anything in particular you'd like us to talk about in the future, let us know. I'd like to also thank Summer Dreggs, a local artist, for contributing his music to the podcast, and for OCI for contributing all of our sturdy furniture. You've been watching Common Purpose. I'm Tim Kelly. Stay healthy and stay hopeful, Chattanooga. Thank you.
Baby, hold me. And I love it that you know me so much better than